Hello, I'm Harvey Ambrose, and I'm preaching this message on behalf of the Missionary Baptist Voice of Africa radio program, which is broadcast from our radio station in Monrovia, Liberia. And continuing in our study of the book of Genesis, we are in chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21, beginning our reading in verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said. The Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived, and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare unto him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, Who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children son? For I have borne unto him a child in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, while he was, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, Let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. And all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her voice. For in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, took bread and a bottle of water, and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water was spent in the bottle. And she cast the child under one of the shrubs. And she went and sat down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot. For she said, Let me not see the death of the child. She sat over against him, and lifted up her voice, and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad to drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew, and dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. And I'll end that lengthy reading there. I'll try to talk about this some. For those who haven't heard earlier broadcasts from the book of Genesis that describe how Abraham had been promised a child, and that he would be born, and he had not been born for a long time. After repeated promises, no children came to him. His wife Sarah was barren, and they were both very old. And the Lord assured him that he would have a son, not from a servant, but from his own flesh would produce a child. Well, then his wife Sarah decided to help that along and have Abraham take one of her female slaves to wife and to bed. And he did so and conceived a son and named him Ishmael. The problem was that after Ishmael was born, Hagar, the slave, despised her mistress, Sarah. And so her mistress mistreated her because of the despising, and she fled to the wilderness. And God brought her back. Well, now, this incident took place probably 17 to 18 years following Hagar's first flight. Abraham has now had a child through his wife, Sarah, him being 100 years old, his wife being 90 years old. And according to a promise given by God, I would think probably just exactly 9 months prior that Sarah would conceive and have a child, because of the emphasis that is placed on here in chapter 21, where it says that God did to Sarah as he had spoken, because she conceived. She had a child in Abraham's old age and in her old age. It was born unto him, it says, at the set time of which God had spoken to Abraham. And Abraham, having seen that God was faithful in his timing, was faithful in his own works, and acted expeditiously and according to what God had told him with respect to circumcising his son Isaac, and with respect to casting out his first son Ishmael. Now, what we have in this chapter is as a telling of a story that is common to humanity. I mean, we may say, well, it's not common, it's a very unique circumstance. Well, perhaps the names and the events and the miraculous birth of Isaac when his father was 100 and his mother was 90, those are unique. But with respect to the human condition, meaning the one that you and I and everyone in the world share, that condition, a condition born out of sin which is in our nature, in our being from conception, having been born naturally of sinful parents and a product of that sin. We live a life in a world in which there's happiness and there's sorrow, in which there is rejoicing and weeping, in which gifts are given and also privileges taken away, in which people treat us well and people treat us poorly. These things are common. Even within families, these things are common. Elder children not playing nice with younger children. Children not playing nice with each other. An older brother having a distrust and maybe a disdain for a younger brother. Or just generally speaking, people who are close to us in family or in other ways, in school or acquaintances at work, people that we have regard for, suddenly doing something that offends us and makes us angry, or says something to us that hurts our feelings, or does something to us that changes our life and makes us very sorrowful and very sad. This is all everyday things in a world of lost people. God did not bring this trouble upon the world. Mankind brought the trouble into the world at the behest of Satan And God has been dealing with the consequences of that according to justice, but also according to mercy. And I don't think that as long as we live in the world, we'll ever find the world to be a perfect place to live. I don't think that just because we are of the few that God saves, He has saved us. If you're one of those, you should not think that because that has been done, a great blessing has happened to you, that somehow you're going to live the rest of your life without sorrow, without grief, and without people taking offense at what you've done, or you taking an offense to what they've done, of having your feelings hurt, having people treat you badly or mocking you, particularly if you have been born again. The children of the kingdom are treated like their master was. They are disdainfully used, like Ishmael did to Isaac, the child of promise. But I'll try to get into the particulars here, and hopefully it will be instructive to us in some degree. So, at long last, after 100 years, I'd say many of them, more than half probably, he had been married to his wife Sarah. Abraham now has a son by his wife. A son not possible according to nature. I mean, yes, their bodies produced it, but God took a hand in that. We read that by faith, God gave Sarah strength to conceive. It's in Hebrews chapter 11. Through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even of one, speaking of Abraham, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and that through his seed, all nations of the world would be blessed. Well, this has come to pass in its early stages by the birth of Isaac, through the intervention of God miraculously in the circumstances of Abraham and Sarah. They had been faithful for a very long time. They had also sinned, but they also trusted God. And we're going to sin even if we get saved, but trusting God is the difference. And so now when this day has come, and Sarah finally conceives a child, she is very happy about it. They call his name, according to what God had told them, Isaac. It means laughter. And so it says in verse 6, Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh. In other words, she was happy. She was so happy because she had been barren all her life, and now she's got a son, her own son, in her old age, 90 years old, and she laughs. It's an appropriate thing that God instructed them to call him Isaac, meaning laughter. Abraham had laughed when he heard the news that Sarah was going to have a son by him. He laughed with joy over it. Sarah laughed not in unbelief. In other words, it was a cynical laughter. She did not believe what God said, not initially, and she laughed thinking that's impossible. Ishmael laughs, mocks. I don't know how you can mock someone without doing it in an atmosphere of contempt and I guess ridicule, laughter against the person that you're oppressing. Ishmael laughed at Isaac. But we have a saying, he who laughs last, I can't say it. He who laughs last, laughs best. When it was all said and done, Isaac was the heir of Abraham and Sarah, the only heir. And through him, then, the blessing that God gave Abraham is renewed to Isaac later in life, so that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And that would pass down to Jacob, and God again repeats that promise to Jacob. So these three, whom we call patriarchs, each have a specific promise made to them from God. It's the same one that through their seed, and the seed that is spoken of, we learn in the New Testament, is Christ himself, their great descendant, the Lord Jesus Christ. One seed it's speaking about, particularly, not all their children, but Christ. Through Christ, every nation on the earth will be blessed. And it is true. Now, Sarah was laughing. Now, this was when he was born, and then it looks like she was also happy just in the physical blessings that God had disposed. She was able to nurse her own son. Even at 90 years old, God had given her strength both to conceive and to nurse, because she says, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? So it's like, who would have said? I mean, that's a pretty good question. When we start talking about the things that God does for people, there's just no end to how far we can take that. Who would have said that God would have given his only son so that we could be saved? Who would have said that someone so undeserving of mercy as all of us are, particularly myself? Who would have said that God would forgive that much sin? Who would have said that God would have given so much joy to the heart of someone who had been so at enmity with God himself? Who would have said that the blessings that God gives us every day, the sun rises and sets, the rain falls, the air we breathe, the food we eat, all these things in a sinful world that has sinned against God now for 6,000 years, and that God would continue to have mercy upon us? I think all the mercies of God are things in which we could say, who would have said that such a thing would happen? But it did happen with her. We read in verse 8 that Isaac grew, and according to Jewish tradition, from what I can tell, mothers nursed their children for 3 years, and then they weaned them. And so he was weaned, and Abraham, on the very day he was weaned, had a big feast prepared, and they ate it in celebration of his having been weaned. Now, given that I believe that the Bible tells us that Ishmael was 15 years old when Isaac was born. 3 years later, he was weaned. Then what happened the very day of that feast with Hagar would have meant that Ishmael was 18 years old when he was cast out with his mother from the family of Abraham. It said he grew, he was weaned, Abraham had a feast, and then Sarah saw the son of Hagar, meaning Ishmael. Hagar, the Egyptian. It mentions that she was an Egyptian. And her son later married an Egyptian. So there's a reason this is brought in. God had told Abraham back in chapter 15 of Genesis is that he was going to have a covenant with him, and that Abraham's descendants would be mistreated, and that they would be, I won't go to it, but they're going to be mistreated. They're going to wander in a land that's not their own, eventually be enslaved by a people, and then brought forth by God back into the land of Canaan. And he said it would be 400 years in this period of time in which they are really strangers and pilgrims in a land that's not theirs, that they're going to be treated badly, they're going to be afflicted by those around them that are not of the family, and eventually then brought into the land of Canaan and made into a great nation again. Well, here we have Egypt through Ishmael, through Hagar, an Egyptian, her son, Ishmael, who marries an Egyptian, Egypt begins to afflict at that point. Now, it's a very light thing, but it's one person on one person. It's an older over a younger. It is a stronger over a weaker. All these things apply to both how Egypt treated the descendants of Abraham. They'd been a nation longer. They were stronger. They were older. And they afflicted them. It wasn't just them. The Canaanites afflicted them. People, the land where they dwelt, even though it was given them by God, they had no power to make it be the way they wanted it to be. God had to do that for them. They were in a land not their own, for all intents and purposes, and they were ill-treated by other peoples. And so Egypt is brought in, I think, for that purpose. In other words, it's showing that the countdown, where God had told Abraham it'd be 400 years before they came out of that land, the countdown started with Ishmael. That's important when we start looking at the chronology of things and when precisely the children of Israel were brought out of Egyptian bondage and back into the land of Canaan and were given the law. It was 430 years, according to the New Testament, from the time of the covenant until the time that the Lord brought the law down on Mount Sinai through Moses. And anyway, if we're not right in our chronology, we mess up historical evidences that are in the ground and being found by archaeologists when they're looking at the wrong time frame for something to have happened. But that's aside from the point. It is an important point, though, that God brings out here that the first person to afflict was Ishmael, the son of the Egyptian woman. He mocked. We don't know what mocking it was. We don't know what he said. We don't know what he did. But it was not right. He should have loved his little brother. He should have been happy. You know, we're told in this world where good things and bad things happen, you know, God tells us to rejoice with them that rejoice and to weep with those that weep. In other words, don't despise the distress of your neighbor, nor the joy of your neighbor. We need to, even though it may not be consistent with our own emotions at the time, we should try to rise above the differences that divide us from our neighbors and take part in life in this world in such a way that we're a blessing to the world and not a curse. Now, that's incumbent upon the children of God to be that way, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to treat them right. I can't say that I've always done it. I've always should have, and I always shall need to. And so should everyone that is born of God, because we're born into the household of God, not naturally, but supernaturally, like Isaac. We are that thing which God promised himself, a people unto himself, called by his name, born from above, of his seed. The thing that he had patiently and is yet patiently waiting for all such people to be born again into his kingdom, such that there will eventually be a separation of all that which is not his seed from above, that which has not been born again, all people not saved who die in their sins and are fit only for punishment, but yet he is given that which is his lot, the saved of the earth, to be his family forever. And just as there's rejoicing and laughter over Isaac coming into the world, we read Jesus saying that there is joy in the presence of the angels over one sinner that cometh to repentance, which means one sinner that turns to God and gets saved, gets born again, born into the family of God. Now, so because of what happened, the persecution, if you will, of Ishmael against Isaac, Sarah is upset. She goes to Abraham and says, cast out the slave woman and cast out her son, he's not going to be a joint heir with my son. But there's also obviously a spiritual equivalent to that, because the lost who die in their sins will not inherit in the world to come the blessings that the saved will. In fact, they're going to be punished eternally. Their punishments may vary and will vary based upon the conditions that only God knows, but it has to do with how much knowledge they have, how egregious their sins were, depending upon whether or not they were purposeful, deliberately against God and his people, or not, if they were done in ignorance. God knows all these things. His ways are entirely equal, and everyone's punishment will be exactly according to what is right in the sight of God, which is the true arbiter of what is right and wrong. I'm having difficulty with this. I apologize for it. But the situation is that Isaac needed to be cast out, and Ishmael. And it says that Abraham, obviously I am having trouble. You guys need to pray for me as you have time and opportunity, so that I have some measure of the Spirit when I try to preach to you. It's not your fault, but I do need your prayers. It says, the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son, meaning because he loved Ishmael. And God had promised to make of Ishmael a great nation, and he hated to cast him out. He loved his son Ishmael. He loved his son Isaac too. But Sarah wasn't particularly fond of Ishmael or Ishmael's mother, and she wants him gone. And Abraham's torn up about it. And in the one case, if he does what Sarah wants, then he loses his son. And if he doesn't do what Sarah wants, and he has his wife mad at him, he must have taken the matter up to God, because it says in verse 12, and God said unto Abraham. I would imagine if it was very grievous at Abraham's sight, he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord answered him. He says, don't be grieved at it because of Ishmael that you had with the bondwoman, and do everything Sarah told you to do, because it is through Isaac, that the promises are going to come. And so it says, but also, it says, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called, not Ishmael. So in other words, Christ is going to be born of the lineage of Isaac, not the lineage of Ishmael. Both of them are of the lineage of Abraham, but only through the one, the promise, the miraculously born one, miraculously in the flesh, but miraculously nonetheless. And that is, and I'll stop there and say that is true for all the people of God. Every one of them is naturally born. Every one of us was born just like anybody else was born. We had two parents, whether they were there or not. For our upbringing, we had two parents. We had a man and a woman that came together. They had a child. It was all natural procreation. And we're natural, and by nature we are enmity against God. And only by the grace of God can we be forgiven and converted. When we're converted, if we're converted, it's from a supernatural work of God in which something completely new is made, a new creation, a new creature, which has the same old flesh that we're wearing, but within us, the old spirit is crucified with Christ, it's done to death, and a new spirit is given it. Now that new spirit doesn't shine like the sun. It's not able, because it is encased in sinful flesh, to always have the light that it should have. Paul spoke about this as a warfare going on between his flesh and his spirit. Everything I would do, he says, I can't. And all the things that I would not do, I find myself doing. He wants to be delivered from he calls it the body of this death, meaning his own physical self. And he says, who can deliver me? And he says, I thank God through Jesus Christ. So Christ delivers us from the, I won't call it dichotomy, but it's like a dichotomy. You have two persons, in a sense, the old man and the new man, having been born again, warring within one flesh between sin and righteousness, from the day we're born again until the day we die. And our spirits are taken up by angels to God's heaven. And then we will be free of the old man of sin. Anyway, I got off track. But he says, and Isaac shall thy seed be called. And he says, but also of the son of the bondwoman, of Ishmael. He says, I will make him a nation because he's thy seed. Because you love him, Abraham, that's enough reason for me to bless him. Which shows us that even though the world does not acknowledge it, may be ignorant of it, for the sake of God's people who dwell among and in the presence of the lost of this world, God shows favor even to the lost people, even to those people who are hostile to the saved, just because they're precious to those of us whom God has caused to be born again, to be saved. So he puts a burden on our heart for lost people, even lost people who are antagonistic towards us, those who afflict us, those who despise us and mock at us. And I'm sure people seeing this on YouTube have mocked at me many a time. And I perfectly understand that, because before I was saved, I would have laughed myself to death looking at someone like myself preaching and hearing what I say. Because the wisdom of God is not the wisdom of this world. And the two things are at odds with one another. So anyway, because Abraham loved Ishmael, God promises to treat Ishmael well. And he does. However, he says they've got to go, because it was going to set up a situation in that family which would have been destructive of God's purposes and of the happiness of the family. So, he's 18 years old. His mother is healthy enough. He's doing well, and they ought to be able to be on their own. He's becoming a man now. And so Abraham gets up early in the morning. He's quick to do what God has told him to do. He doesn't waste time. Early in the morning, he does a thing he doesn't want to do, but he does it because God told him to, and he trusts God. He gives her bread and water, and the child and her leave, and they go into the wilderness of Beersheba. And then she must have been trying to go where someplace Abraham had told her and failed to find it. But in any event, the food and water didn't last. And it says the water was spent, meaning the bottle was empty, and she cast the child under one of the shrubs. So, meaning she placed him in the shade of a shrub somewhere out in this waste, howling wilderness, I guess. He must have, even though he was a young man, sometimes the young don't have the endurance of the old when it comes to hard times. I don't know why that is. But apparently he was suffering and he was on the point of dying. We could go for a while without food, but going without water, there's only so many days we can do that, and everybody will die from thirst. He must have been, maybe he didn't use his water as judiciously. Maybe he had saved more for his mother. I don't know what the circumstance, but she thought he was dying, and he was in the process, no doubt, of passing away. So she didn't want to see that happen. I mean, just think of the human condition here. My wife and I lost a daughter that was, I guess, 1 year older. If Isaac was 18, our daughter was 19. And the sudden loss of a child it's got to be the greatest, most sorrowful thing that can happen to someone. I mean, at least in this world. I think there's worst things that happen after death to those that are lost. That while we're here, losing a child is a horrible thing. She thought her son were dying, and she did not want to see it. She did not want that image to be in her mind for as long as she lived, which admittedly she probably didn't think she'd live very long, but she just put him somewhere and she went off. It says about a bow shot. So as far as a bow would fling an arrow, and she goes down there, she starts weeping. It says, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against and lifted up her voice and wept. She's crying over the circumstances. You know, had she been more circumspect, she would have never ran from her mistress. And having returned, God bringing her back, she would have been very careful to treat Abraham and Sarah, and calls her son to treat Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac way better. There's a lot of times in family relationships where we'll do one thing that's wrong, or someone else will do one thing to us that's wrong, and it can bring about a catastrophe for the family. Sometimes it's just a word said, so I would assume deeds done or not done, things that should have been done that someone failed to do, and it causes animosity between the members of a family. She should have done all that she could to prevent that, because she had it made living with Abraham and Sarah. Even though she was but a slave, she was also Abraham's wife, father to his son, his eldest son, who should have been treating his younger brother well. All this should have happened, but it didn't happen. There's a lot of things that should happen in our daily lives, one to another, the failure of which to do them by us brings about sorrow that sometimes is pretty hard to get rid of, pretty hard to reconcile. So she's weeping over the situation in which she finds herself. Her son's dying. She's out in the wilderness. She's without water. She's without food. She had plenty back at home, but that's not her home anymore. She's permanently exiled from there. And it says, and God heard the voice of the lad. So her weeping was not apparently in a prayer to God. She was just weeping. She was just sad. She wasn't praying for help. See, when things get to be really bad, that's when we really need to pray. When life, and life does, have very hard things for us. Sometimes things happen to us that are truly more than we think we can live through. It would be easier to die than to live in the circumstances of a child lost, perhaps, or a spouse lost, or other great tragedies. Limbs lost, people that have lost their legs, or people that have lost their eyesight, or there's so many bad things that happen to people in an evil, cursed world. Because of our sin, not because of any wrongness with God. We bring these things on ourselves just like Hagar and Ishmael did. But Ishmael must have been praying. Even though we hear nothing of words spoken, you don't have to speak words to pray. In your heart, you have to pray to God, but you don't have to pray out loud for God to hear you. He looks on the heart. What comes out of the mouth is usually a lie anyway, but what's in the heart, that's where the reality is. And if your heart is set for God, and if your heart is seeking the mercy of God, if the circumstances of life in a sinful world are overwhelming, and you need the help that only God can give, if you need a deliverance that only God can provide, if you have reached the point of extremis in which nothing will do for you except God, God will hear. That's when He hears. It's when your heart has been moved towards him. All your heart is fixed upon him. Trust me, his heart has been on you all your life. Even though you have been as far from him as the east is from the west, his heart has been on you. He gave himself for you before you were born. He died a hard death, made infinitely worse by punishment from above, from his Father. The Father suffered on account of you, and he spared not his own Son on your account. God weeps for the lost, as Jesus wept over Jerusalem time and again. Is it not right and fitting that the objects of the mercy of God also have a desire towards God and have sorrow in their heart over the condition in which they find themselves, being lost and estranged from God, their maker and provider? I don't know what Ishmael prayed, but I know the quality of it, because it reached God, as has my prayers from time to time. And when you pray through to God like that, answers come pretty quick. I'm not talking about a new car. I'm not talking about a new house. I'm talking about needful things that matter, that are life and death to us. He heard the voice of the lad. He heard Ishmael's prayer for help. I don't know what he specifically said, but he needed help. He was dying in a waste, howling wilderness, just like I was when I was lost. And God tells Sarah, I heard it. And he opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. There was a well already there, but she did not have eyes to see it. So often, the solution is right there, but the devil has blinded our eyes so that we don't spiritually see the solution to our problem, which is always Jesus Christ. He's there all along. The Old and New Testament both say that this gospel is not, you don't have to go up to heaven to bring it down, or down to the deep to bring it up. But it's right there. It's close to you. It's even in your mouth and in your heart. It's there. Jesus, the Word of God, is there. In plain sight, if you had eyes to see. Within earshot, if you had ears to hear. You must pray to God to be given the sight to see the solution that He has manifestly placed before you. And the solution for sinners is a Savior that saves from sin and from all the ill consequences of it. Death, punishment, misery, suffering, all those things done away in a moment by the salvation of our God through the Lord Jesus Christ. And He's encouraging her, and He helps her, and eventually they make it. And Ishmael becomes a great father of many nations, and it's the Arab nations is what it is. They're with us to this day. And I'm going to read one last thing in connection with this. I've always found it to be similar to what the story here reveals. It's in Ezekiel chapter 16. It's talking about the Jewish people only as a type or a shadow, though. It's about all of us who get saved. It's about those who have a need for God, and God sees their needs and He answers it. And it was the way here mentioned, it's with everyone that gets saved. And He says, about us, about our condition when he finds us. And as for thy nativity, meaning your birthday, in the day that thou wast born, this is God looking upon us that he saves. In the day that thou wast born, thy navel was not cut. Neither wast thou washed in water to supple thee. Thou wast not salted at all, nor swaddled at all. None eye pitied thee, to do any of these unto thee, to have compassion upon thee. But thou wast cast out in the open field to the loathing of thy person in the day that thou wast born. It's like a child that the parents didn't want, they just threw it out to die. That's how we are spiritually by nature. Nobody cares about us but one. That's God. Verse 6 of Isaiah 16. He says, and when I passed thee, God, when I passed thee, he says, I saw thee polluted in thine own blood. I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. See, he sees us, even though nobody else cares. Jesus cares. And he sees our ruined condition, and he has one word for us, life everlasting. And by the speaking of it, we hear the voice of the Son of God, and we live. We pass from the death that is ours by nature into life everlasting. And eventually a glorified body in a new world in heavens, and everything's going to be set straight for those whom God finds in the wilderness of sin and exalts ultimately the riches of heaven, and are made to be partakers of his divine nature. And I'll end with that. I've gone over time. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.